So we've been looking at the adaptability of the efficient versus inefficient animals on rangeland.
Basically, finding that cow that can do everything she's supposed to do, but do it with less in her environment, which is the driving motivation for the research that we're going to talk about with my guest today, Dr. Jim Sprinkle with the University of Idaho. Their latest research looks at grazing behavior of cow-calf pairs on rugged rangeland pastures, and what can we get from that data if we're going to match cows to our environment. But keep in mind, we have been an industry in the past that's been chasing weight and high production cattle.
We're just on the bubble of not fitting the environment. And, this is something that I think most people recognize.
So what are the behaviors that we see in efficient cattle versus the behaviors in non-efficient cattle? Tune in on today's episode of the Working Ranch Radio Show. And we welcome you here to another edition of the Working Ranch Radio Show. I'm Justin Mills. Glad to have you along for our program here today. How's things going in your neck of the woods? I know for us here, we were able to get our calves pre-conditioned this past week. We got the heifer pairs done, as well as the older set of cows. So we're kind of getting underway with fall work. But what would be nice is to see a little bit cooler weather. I don't know what it's like in your neck of the woods, but for us here in our part of the country, it's still continuing to just be dry, and summer is just hanging on for dear life. Didn't anybody tell the weather that it is now the fall and we should be seeing cooler weather with moderate temperatures through the day and sprinkled in with a little bit of moisture? That would be the perfect scenario. But nevertheless, that's what we're dealing with. I know in the southeastern part of the country, you folks, it's a different story, dealing with the aftermath of the initial hit of the hurricane down there. And as we'll hear from meteorologist Don Day later on in the show, he'll tell us what he expects to see as that continues to move inland, and the moisture and how far reaching into the interior of the country we're going to see that moisture. Of course, for us in the west, unfortunately, it looks like maybe a little bit drier weather, but he'll tell us what he's anticipating and when that may change as we look into the first part of October. Also joining later on in the show, the Captain Tim O'Byrne, editor of Working Ranch Magazine, will be in for this week's edition of Tim's 2 Cents. So a full show lined up for you here today. By the way, if you didn't catch last week's show, it was an opportunity where I looked at 3 different products in the industry that I had questions about, something I felt that those same conversations you might find useful as well, as we looked at Barn Owl, which has remote camera type systems and how that can be used on your ranch. Then we also looked at blood pregnancy tests. Now that's interesting. It's definitely been around for a while, but I had a few questions on it. And then we talked with the folks at RanchBot about their water monitoring systems as well. So a good program to go back and listen to if you've had questions about some of those products. You might find some information in there useful as well. And also in regards to today's show, we're going to be talking some research and some numbers. So it's going to be one of those shows you want to go back and listen to it again and pick out those pieces. I think you'll find some very interesting data coming out of this as we visit with our guest here today. So with that, I want to introduce to you Dr. Jim Sprinkle, who is the Extension Beef Specialist focusing in nutrition for the University of Idaho. Now he's based out of the Nancy M. Cummings Research, Education, and Extension Center in Carmen, Idaho. And Dr. Sprinkle, thanks for joining us here today on the Working Ranch Radio Show.
Glad to be here.
Well, Dr. Sprinkle, I reached out to you initially because I'm interested in knowing more, and we're going to talk about it later here in the show, on cow and calf grazing behaviors on rugged rangeland and pastures. And I know in looking through some of the other research projects that you have been a part of is really that kind of has been a driving force. And I think some of that is getting down to, what is that ideal cow? Now, as we know, sometimes that ideal cow could be different for different environments to a point, and that's been a conversation that we've had from time to time here on our program. But nevertheless, when we look at some of these kinds of condition, finding that ideal cow or knowing what traits they have and what characteristics that we're looking for, that's really been kind of the driving force behind some of these research projects that you all have been working on.
It's a challenge nowadays. Cows are roughly 200 or 300 pounds heavier than they were back when I was a kid. And some of those cows have quite an appetite, and that takes a lot of resources to support that type of animal. And we've been chasing weaning weights for a long time. And so as a consequence, the milk production has also increased as the calf weaning weights have increased. So those cows are getting harder and harder to fit into a typical rangeland environment. So back, in the 70s, 80s, Dr. Don Kress and some of his colleagues, they did quite a bit of study on matching the cow to the environment. And at that point in time, a cow that would fit a lot of the rangeland environment would be about 1,000, 1,100 pounds, and they would have moderate milk production and 15 to 18 pounds at peak milk production. And nowadays, we're pushing 1,400 pound cows, and we're pushing 25 pounds of milk production. And so at that state, when they did their study, they looked at the rainfall of the West and what would be needed to support that kind of cow without providing a lot of extra feed resources. And at that point in time, we were within the bubble of fitting a lot of these cows, but now we're just on the bubble of not fitting the environment. And, this is something that I think most people recognize, but just not a lot has happened in meeting that requirement of cows fitting the environment. And I think there are a few breeders that are doing that, but I think by and large, calves are sold on pounds. Bulls, replacement bulls, people, when they go buy a bull, they want to get a bull that has a lot of growth. And so we're in that cycle where it's just harder and harder to make profitability. Dr. Lawman down at Oklahoma State, he looked at some of that old data, and it's almost a wash for the amount of extra pounds of calf weight that we're getting out of these extra heavier cows and with the higher milk production. And when you run the economics on it, it's really difficult to justify.
Mm-hmm. So, Dr. Sprinkle, let's start us from the beginning of how this kind of evolved over the years and where we're at now at the University of Idaho with looking at these animals and classifying them as efficient or inefficient, and kind of how that started to where we're at today.
So when I came up here to Idaho in 2015, I spent 20 years in Arizona at the University of Arizona. And when I came up here, we had a bunch of females that had been through the Grow Safe units here, where they look at residual feed intake for feed efficiency. And very little has been done with those type of animals on rangeland. Most of the studies that are published are with feedlot animals. And so it was a real opportunity for us to do something. And so we've been looking at the adaptability of the efficient versus inefficient animals on rangeland. And of course, the efficient animals, they would consume less feed for the same level of performance. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of bulls that are sold in various parts of the West and throughout the country on residual feed intake and their performance with that trait. I'm not saying that's the only trait that you should select for, but they are classified. So we did some of the first studies. The very first study we did, we just looked at some cows that were almost 3 years old, and we had them on sagebrush steppe pasture over by DuBois, Idaho, and we did not provide them with any protein supplement. We put some collars on, but we also looked at their performance, and when we started, it was about a 78-day time period, those inefficient animals tended to have a little bit more body condition than the efficient animals right after weaning, but by the time we pulled them off of there, they had lost considerably more weight, the inefficient animals, than the efficient animals. And so from that, we surmised that, at least with those non-lactating animals, that their maintenance requirements did not seem to be as great out on rangeland. So then we wanted to look at lactating animals. So the next study we did was down at a range unit we have down near Haley, Idaho, Sun Valley area. And we had 2-year-old cows that we were looking at, and we had 12 of them that were efficient and 12 of them that were inefficient. And we repeated that study for 2 years, and we found some pretty remarkable things, I think. The first thing we found was that when the temperatures were mild early in the spring, those inefficient animals grazed longer than did the efficient animals. They have a greater appetite, and so they spent about 1.7 hours longer per day grazing. But as soon as it got hot, those inefficient animals did not do that anymore. So what happened was that in the springtime, they would start grazing a little earlier and graze a little longer into the morning. And when it got hot, they didn't do that. But what they did do is they spent more time resting, laying down in the heat of the day. And then when we looked at the GPS data, those inefficient animals did not climb as high in the pasture. They spent more time down lower in the pasture, closer to water. And so what we attributed to that was just more heat increment, more heat load on those animals that have greater appetite. So, I mean, you can think about it this way. You put a 454 engine into a truck and you compare the amount of heat generated by that versus a small V8, and there's a big difference. And so there's a big difference with these animals that have higher intake. They have to have a higher or bigger GI tract to support that intake. And so it generates heat. It's an advantage in the wintertime. It's not an advantage in the summertime. That's some of the main findings on that study. So then we looked at some gene markers, and we found that we didn't tie it to efficient versus inefficient, but we found that we could explain about 50% of the variation in how steep a slope they used with those gene markers. So we can predict that some of these animals that are climbing higher in the pasture, we can use those markers to help identify those animals. We're not the only ones that have found that. They found the same thing at New Mexico State. Mm-hmm. So some other things that we found with these efficient versus inefficient animals is there's a difference in how they graze. Those inefficient animals, because they have that greater nutritional demand, they tend to do more search grazing. They wander more as they're grazing. They're looking for the better quality feed. The efficient animals are more purposeful about how they graze. They just get in, get the job done. And so we would find that on a lot of days that those inefficient animals would be grazing about an hour or more per day. I mean, walking an hour more per day than was the efficient animals.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Well, Jim, I think now's a good time to take a break here. My guest, folks, is Dr. Jim Sprinkle, who is the beef extension specialist for the University of Idaho. And we are going through some of the information they've just released and talking about a study that they are working on. Now, they're still going through and deciphering some of this data, but it's in regards to cow and calf grazing behavior on rugged rangeland pastures. And we've already talked about some of the earlier research that they've done. And we're going to continue looking at that and kind of drawing some conclusions out of that research that would be helpful for not only producers on rangeland, but just producers in general with your cows and understanding the efficient cows and the inefficient cows that they were able to identify in their research studies. We're going to take a break here and continue on when we come back. This segment today brought to you by Barn Owl. Real-time awareness starts here. Always know with Barn Owl, you can build your off-grid camera system today by going to their website at barnowl.tech. Are you tired of putting the wear and tear on your ranch pickup or your good side-by-side out checking stock tanks or reservoirs? Or maybe it's just keeping an eye on a remote ranch location. When you stop and you think about it and you start to calculate the cost of your time, fuel, and miles on your vehicles, you're going to scare yourself. But there really is a very simple and a reassuring solution, and it's called Barn Owl. Barn Owl off-grid cameras and smart alerts provide you that assurance, and there's no question it is a time and a money saver. From anywhere at any time, no Wi-Fi or power needed. Build your off-grid camera system today at barnowl.tech. Real-time awareness starts here. Always know with Barn Owl. Welcome back to the Working Ranch Radio Show. My guest today is Dr. Jim Sprinkle. He is an extension beef specialist at the University of Idaho Nancy M. Cummings Research Center out of Carmen, Idaho. That's just located just north of Salmon, Idaho a little bit. And Dr. Sprinkle, in that last segment, as you were going through some of that and looking at certain gene markers that were maybe some indicators on the efficient cattle versus the non-efficient cattle? And maybe you're going to get to that as we're going here. What were you finding in those gene markers? Is it tied to a certain breed? Is it a composite breed that you're finding works the best? Tell me what you were finding in that.
Yeah, so we only have the cows that we had in our studies. So we've got Hereford Angus cross cows, pretty standard cow for a lot of the West, and that's what we were using. So the markers are confined to those varying percentages of either Hereford or Angus parentage in that. The New Mexico study that I referred to, they had more different kinds of breeds, but we found like 4 different markers related to grazing behavior, and just the terrain use is something that's kind of important.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk then about how the tools that you use to measure some of this data and the details of that, because I think therein lies the ways in which you were able to get very detailed data from your research.
Right. So we did have GPS, of course, and that has been around for some time, and everybody's familiar with that. We also used accelerometers, and an accelerometer is used on rockets. And I never thought I'd be able to say that I was involved in rocket science, but there you go.
Your folks would be proud of you.
Yeah. So it measures velocity in 3 directions: up and down, side to side, and backwards and forwards. And so you've got those 3 different directions. So you can pair that with head movements, and you can not only, the GPS will tell you where they're at, but the accelerometer will tell you what they're doing while they're there. And so we break it into either grazing, resting, or walking. And if you've got a smartphone, you've got an accelerometer on you. It's what rotates the screen when you're going from portrait to landscape. And so that's the technology. We have to follow those cows in a smaller area if we can for 3 or 4 days to get a data signature, because every animal is a little bit different. If you think about it, if you have somebody you're very familiar with and you were in a building with a wooden floor, you could recognize who was coming down the hallway without even seeing them from the sounds of their footsteps. So animals, their anatomy is a little different. The way they move and react is a little different. So we get that data signature, and then we're able to determine what we're doing. And those accelerometers, they capture a lot of data and measures at a rate of 25 times a second. And the GPS, we've had it anywhere from 2 to 7 minutes, but the accelerometer, we get that data. And so then we can tell what they're doing on a 24-hour time period. And, in a general rule, like in the wintertime, the cows may be grazing in our part of the world about an average of 10 and a half hours a day. In the summertime, somewhere between 8 and 9.5, maybe 10, sometimes a little more than 10. But it varies a lot from day to day. That's one thing that we've learned, is those animals are very variable. You'll have days that they'll only graze about 6.5 or 7 hours a day. And then you'll have days when they'll jump up there close to 12 hours a day. We've even had some of these animals on this late fall grazing that have grazed up to 14 hours a day. And they might do those long grazing days a day or two, and then they'll have to rest up after that because, it gets them tired.
Mm-hmm. You had talked about heat also, the time of the day, or some of those cows that can generate more heat in the wintertime. Of course, they also generate that same heat in the summertime. So when it gets into these temperatures that are in the summertime, that it's higher heat, what have you seen there as far as just in general, the amount of time that cows are grazing? Is there variation, or are they dialing down?
Yeah, they are dialing down, but what we've seen so far is it's more pronounced with those inefficient animals that have the greater intake, because they're generating more heat. Mm-hmm. And like, for instance, a couple of days I can think of that we compared the efficient versus inefficient cows. In August, we had one day when the temperatures were pretty mild, and those inefficient animals grazed about an hour and a half or 2 hours more than did the efficient animals. And then on another day in the same time period, when the temperatures were up about 80 degrees or more, then we found that they grazed an hour and a half less than the efficient animals. And so what we have seen, there's in the scientific literature, there's these formulas that just looks at the relative humidity and the temperature, and you can calculate the heat load, metabolic heat load. And we have seen in our world where we don't have a lot of humidity, but we've seen that when that temperature gets up about 79 or 80 degrees, then we start seeing some changes in the behavior of those animals. And those animals that are more heat stressed, they're going to be more affected by that.
Okay, that makes sense. That answers that question. So I could see where those cows that are generating more heat just can't tolerate those hot days as well. So that would make a lot of sense.
Yeah, and so it takes energy to climb hillsides, and they're not going to climb as high when they're in the heat.
In regards to your water, now we kind of know, I mean, there's a lot of studies in regards to water intake on this. What were you finding any elements to that? Because as you were saying, you have the ability to really know exactly what those cattle were doing. What did your research find in regard to movement to water or even hanging around water?
Well, the pasture that we were using down near Haley has a creek flowing through it, so there are several points that they can water at. So it wouldn't be as pronounced as if you were in a pasture with a single water source, a storage tank that they were drinking out of. But we have seen mostly just they're sticking closer to those water sources when it's hotter, and they're just not climbing as high up in the hills. And well, that's one of the main things that we've seen.
Okay. So we were talking kind of in this segment, really more talking about the methods and the uses. You talked about the technology that's used in that. Anything else from a technological standpoint that's allowed you to really get really good and concise data from these studies?
Well, I think the accelerometers and the GPS pretty much allow us to do what we want to do, and we can pair that with the maps that we download, GIS maps that give us the elevation, the slope, and all that kind of thing.
Well, let's talk about that real quick. Not everybody's completely aware of what are we dealing with for just the climate element there. Let's talk about, rainfall, topography that you're dealing with there, the rise and the drop in elevation that you see just in a single pasture. That would maybe put into context what we're going to be looking at when we look at this data next.
Yeah, so the range unit down at Rinker Rock Creek Ranch down near Haley, Idaho, that we're using, annual precipitation's about 13.4 inches a year. And it ranges from about 4,800 feet to about 5,600 feet, a little more than that. And so the slopes in the pastures, one pasture was like 5 to 25%. The other was like up to about 15%. But, as a general rule, they can easily get into slopes greater than 15, 20%. Usually rangeland scientists often say that when a cow's on the 15% or greater slope, then there's less use in a pasture.
Okay. Well, Jim, let's take another break here. And when we come back, I want to get specifically into the findings of this last research project, specifically regarding how cows and calves behavior was when it comes to grazing on these conditions that we have already talked about here. So we'll do that after the break. Now, it's also a good time to go refill your coffee cup. It's what I'm going to do. I've got a pot of Cowpuncher coffee up in the kitchen. I'm going to go refill my coffee cup here at the break. I encourage you to do the same. By the way, Cowpuncher coffee, it's what we drink here at the X-Ring Ranch in the Workin' Ranch Radio Show studios, and it's a good cup of coffee to try out. If you haven't already and you're looking for something that's not only has good, bold flavor, but a lot of different choices to choose from, you can go to cowpunchercoffee.com and you can order everything from whole bean to already ground coffee, or try their samplers as well. They've got a lot of different varieties, including K-Cups as well. So give Jim or Trish Williams a call. Check them out at cowpunchercoffee.com. Grab a mug. Let's spur the day with Cowpuncher Coffee. This segment today brought to you by Zoetis. Back your instincts and feel more confident in your replacement selection this fall with Inherent Select from Zoetis. Visit beefgenetics.com/working ranch to get started. And boy, the genetic information you're going to find there, very applicable to some of the conversation that we're having here today. We'll be back after this.
It's decision time. Which heifers are you keeping? Which are you selling? Make sort gate decisions easier with genomic EPDs for your commercial females. Back your instincts with Inherit Select from Zoetis. Feel more confident knowing you're selecting heifers with the potential to be the most productive and profitable in your herd. Keep the best. Sell the rest. Zoetis makes it easy. Order free supplies today so you can easily collect tissue samples when you work cattle this fall. Visit beefgenetics.com/working ranch to get started.
Welcome back to the Working Ranch Radio Show. My guest this day is Dr. Jim Sprinkle with the University of Idaho. They're an extension beef specialist. And Dr. Sprinkle, up until now in our show here today, we've been talking about, in the first segment, laying out kind of what's the driving force behind much of the research that you guys have been doing there, specifically looking at the efficiency and trying to find efficiency, the gene markers, the things in cattle that make them efficient and productive on rangeland environments. And so let's get into this latest study, because we've already talked about some of the studies that have been done, some of the things that you have already been doing and looking at what some behaviors are in efficient cattle and non-efficient cattle. Let's talk about and lay out, first of all, just kind of what the outline is of this latest research study we're talking about here today.
We found the things that I described earlier, and so then it got us thinking, well, how much of what is happening is due to the calves' genes and how much is due to learned behavior. And so we're trying to get at some of that. And so we had 36 cows and their calves that we had collars on. And half of the cows were efficient, half of the cows were inefficient. And we don't know on the calves yet because they haven't been tested in the growth safe unit in the feedlot, but we can determine which cows they were out of. And so we have followed those cows and their calves in mid-lactation and late lactation. So we put the collars on in May, June time period, and then we removed them, and then we put them back on in July through August time period. And what some of the preliminary things that we found is that calves do kind of mirror what their moms do to some extent, but then some of what we found, just looking at some of the individual calf data, is you've heard of these babysitter cows.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And it's kind of a real thing we've found, particularly when those calves are younger, is both of them will get up and start grazing early in the morning about daybreak. The cow usually will might get up a little earlier than the calf, but then the calf will get up and the calf will graze a while, and then the cow might walk to water. But oftentimes that calf will stay back with some babysitter cows while those cows go down and get a drink, and then they'll come back. Calf may get up and walk with the calf a while, walk with the cow a while, graze a little bit, and then they'll lay down again, of course, close to noon or before, anywhere between 10 a.m. and 12 p.m. And then in the mid-afternoonish, the cow will get up and graze, and the calf may get up and graze as well. And we found that just one cow I can think of, inefficient cow, in that late afternoon time spot, she went up on the hills and grazed, but the calf did not do that. The calf stayed down on the lower elevations and grazed. What we have found is that when those cows and calves were on a little flatter terrain in July when it was really hot, both cows and calves got up earlier. The inefficient cows and their calves got up earlier in the morning to start grazing. As soon as we moved to a pasture with a little more terrain, we didn't see that activity, probably because of some fatigue factors. We did see those inefficient cows grazing a little later into the morning. We also have found that the efficient calves were grazing on more southwestern, southerly facing slopes. I think that's because that's what the cow was doing, but those calves from the efficient cows, they were tolerating a little more heat load than were the inefficient cows, and would use those slopes that had more solar radiation than the others. And we found that in both years. One thing that we found was pretty interesting. We had one day that the cows walked about 3 to 5 times greater than they did during other days. And so we got to looking, well, was there a predator? We had some cameras in the pasture. There was no predator problems. But what we did finally figure out is on that day that those cows started moving, we got some wind. And so it took away some of that heat load. And so those inefficient cows were very pronounced with it. So they want to get out and eat. But if it's really hot, it depresses their natural ability to go out and harvest forage. But on that day that they had the long hike, I call it, they traveled about 9 miles that day.
Really?
As opposed to about 6 miles for the efficient cows. And they ended up walking 4.2 hours that day. The inefficient cows did. No, 4.7, I guess it was. And the efficient cows only walked 3.2 hours a day. So the calves were following the cows. But on the day following that, those calves from the inefficient cows, they didn't get up and follow the cows because they were tuckered out. We looked at the average distance between the cow and her calf. And on that day following the big hike, the calves that followed the efficient cows, they were on an average of 951 feet away from the moms. So they just kind of stayed down at the bottom of the hills. And the calves from the efficient cows, they were 0.03 feet away. So they were right with the cows.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I got a question regarding the cows that you did, and this was over 2 years. Did you have a cow or cows that in 1 year you would mark them as inefficient and 1 year they were efficient, or vice versa?
So we evaluate those cows as yearling heifers, and we have not reclassified them. There are some studies where they have looked at reclassification. So it happens some, but I think it's not as much a general rule as you would expect. So you can have some cows that re-rank, but most of the time you can place some assurance that they're probably going to react the same way. Where they've seen the biggest differences maybe is if you compare them on a forage diet and then you compare them on a grain diet, so you can have some re-ranking there. I'm saying that it can happen, but we're dealing with 36 animals over the 2-year time period, and we feel pretty good about the data we're getting.
Yeah. Well, let's take another break here. And when we come back, I want to take basically all of our conversation that we've had here today in regards to the data that they've been able to pull out of not only this research project, but also previous ones as well, and kind of pull out some conclusions from that might be useful for us as producers as well. This segment today brought to you by the American Gelbvieh Association. Meet modern industry demand for feedlots and carcass traits with Gelbvieh and Balancer Genetics. Find out more at gelbvieh.org.
Capitalize on crossbreeding with Gelbvieh and Balancer bulls. Raise replacement females with added fertility, increased longevity, and greater productivity. Gelbvieh and Balancer influenced females wean more pounds of calf per cow exposed. In the feed yard, Balancer influenced cattle offer increased performance, improved feed efficiency, and have excellent carcass merit. Balancers add the pounds, make the grade, and deliver the value. Make your crossbreeding count with Gelbvieh and Balancer Genetics.
You know, when it comes to agriculture, real estate, there's definitely not a shortage of folks in that business. And really, for a lot of them, all they can really do is market your asset. But what there is a shortage of are folks that'll sit down with you right there at the kitchen table or maybe across the bed of your pickup and bring a multifaceted approach to the future of your land asset. Now, I know while selling might be what you're considering, have you thought, though, through some of your other options? What about having someone guide you through leasing or ranch management? When you want someone with expertise, the experience, the reputation, and the integrity, providing you the best options that will help you and your family make that decision that you will feel confident about in the future years. Well, back in 1946, Henry Hall and his son Warren founded Hall Mortgage Company, and 78 years now, we know them as Hall & Hall, and they're one of the most diverse companies in the country that can work in agriculture, real estate, with listings all through the United States and Canada. They're multifaceted in their ability to not only broker real estate, but also provide long-term financing for buyers, also appraisals, brokerage, and auction services for landowners. But yet they still do have a strong desire to see land stay in production agriculture, whether it's with the current ranch family owners or the new buyers. Hall & Hall can assist with those day-to-day operations, to hiring, to lease negotiation. I've known the folks at Hall & Hall for nearly 25 years, and I trust that they will guide you through those next steps that you might be considering regarding your ranch operation. If you go to their website at hallandhall.com, not only can you find more information about all of their services, but you'll also see a phrase in there that I think speaks volumes about the depth of that company and the people you're going to work with at Hall & Hall. It says, dedicated to the land and landowners since 1946. Find out more again at hallandhall.com. Well, as we get back to our program here today, my guest is Dr. Jim Sprinkle. He's the Extension Beef Specialist with the University of Idaho. Of course, the University of Idaho is there out of Moscow, but he's over the mountain in Carmen, Idaho, which is where the University of Idaho's Nancy M. Cummings Research, Education, and Extension Center is located. And Dr. Sprinkle, real quick before we talk about just some preliminary thoughts, first blush coming out of this research that you've been doing on studying the behavior of these cows, calves, pairs, on how they're grazing rangeland and pastures. A thought occurred to me because you have GPS collars, accelerometers also onto these animals as well. And so one of the things I was thinking about is there's some data coming off that would be useful just in terms of for producers just to understand general behavior of cattle, not how they're grazing, but just general cattle behavior.
Yeah, we learn something, every sample, every trial that we run, we learn some new things about their behavior. I guess some things that I have picked up is the averages kind of fit with what you see in the scientific literature, but the day-to-day activity can be quite variable. So here's in July of 2022, we had 31 cows and 30 calves that we ended up with good data from. And on average, the cows would rest from 12 to 13 hours a day. They'd graze about 9 hours a day. They'd walk about 2.5 to a little over 3 hours a day. The calves would rest 1 or 2 hours more than the cows. They would graze 2 hours less. They'd nurse about 0.8 of an hour. But when I looked at some of the variability from day to day, we had cows that grazed as little as 6 hours in a day and as much as almost 12 hours, and rested as little as 9 hours a day and as much as 15 hours, and walked less than an hour a day to walking more than 8 hours in a day. And so the climate can really affect them. And some of the winter type studies that we've done, we'll have, when a winter storm comes in, those cows, they'll just go looking for shelter. And so they may graze a couple hours less that day than they would when it is a little more mild. Cows are a lot smarter than we give them credit for, and they know how to use, if they're adapted to an area, they know how to use the country. And you can look at older cows versus younger cows. If you're in a winter grazing situation, oftentimes you'll find those older cows, they'll be standing in front of a slope, broadside to the sun, to try and warm up. And they're not only getting warmed up from the sun hitting them, but they're also getting warmed up by the sun bouncing on the ground behind them, bouncing up and warming on the other side. The other things that we found is that what I've mentioned already, with the babysitter cows, the calves following the cow's activity, but not always. And then those inefficient cows appear to be more impacted by the heat, and they tend to engage in more search grazing.
Mm-hmm. In the first segment, you were talking about what was spurring some of this on was that effort to try to find the holy grail in the range cattle business, and that is that perfect cow and what that's going to look like and what she's going to look like. And in that, you said we're just kind of on the verge of maybe outside of the bubble with our industry of some of the things and the things that we've bred into our industry. And my question to you would be is, do you think some of that we're breeding in there, as you had said, we're continuing to chase weights, not necessarily net or profit, we're chasing high weights, weaning weights. So we've seen an increase in milk and things like that. How much of that is also, you can say, well, we bred this into the cow, but how much of that is also just, and this is more of an economic question, not a nutritionist question I'm going to throw at you here, but how much of that's been spurred by the fact that many of our ranches are subsidized to where they're not having to generate entire profit off the ranch?
So you're talking about somebody has a job in town and they're subsidizing the cow operation.
Well, it means that they can go buy feed and they don't have to rely on these cows to make it. And instead of, maybe feed for 75, 90 days, they're feeding 150, 180 days a year or more.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's difficult, but I think that we need to be looking at what our net profit per cow and our net profit per acre is, and try to work around that end. I will tell you that I was visiting with a manager of one of the largest cattle operations in the West. They run over 1 million acres, and he said that some of those breed companies, genetics companies, got a lot of those big operators together and asked them, "What do you need most?" And he said, "We need moderate-sized bulls with low milk production so we can produce cows that will fit our environment." And so these big operations, that's all they do. And so they're trying to maximize that profit per cow. There's a lot of things you can do. I think if you've got the opportunity to make use of late season dormant forage and use some protein supplement, and then you can reduce your feed cost and you can help reduce your weight loss by providing the supplement. But I really think that we need to look at what kind of cow we're putting out there. And I know I've done some economic analysis on just looking at some of these different kind of cows, and the exceptional year, most of the time, the extra feed costs that it takes for an extra 100 pounds of cow is not justified by the extra weight you get off the cow. So I think Dave Lawman has some of his older data said each extra 100 pounds is another $42 in feed costs, counting pasture and hay or whatever. And if you look at how many pounds of calf you're getting for that extra 100 pounds, you might be getting 9 pounds.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So as we kind of wrap up here, and you kind of briefly mentioned there in the last question that I asked there, just some takeaways for producers just in general, but in realization that the fact that, the average herd size in the country is, 25, 30 head, 35 head, somewhere in there. What's the general takeaway that you would say just to the ranching industry as a whole and producers as a whole based upon the studies that you guys have found there?
Well, our hope is that we could validate these markers with the larger size. And our hope is that you could go out and look at a weanling heifer, get a blood sample or an ear sample from her, and see if she has that markers that would fit her to use some of these rugged rangelands that we have that are difficult to get cattle to cover, and that you could just kind of select some of those animals that would be good candidates to keep into the herd. And then over time, then possibly being more efficient and making more profit per cow.
You bet. All right. Well, Dr. Sprinkle, appreciate you taking the time to join us here on the program today.
All right. Glad to meet with you.
You bet. And again, that was Dr. Jim Sprinkle, Extension Bee Specialist with the University of Idaho. He's based there out of the Nancy M. Cummings Research Education Extension Center located in Carmen, Idaho. That's just a little bit north of Salmon, Idaho. And this truly is one of these programs that is one you're going to want to go back and listen to again, because there's little tidbits of information in there that just on the general listening through the first time you're not going to catch, I can guarantee you. And it's really valuable if this is something that you do and you're in a part of the country that has a little tougher climate, maybe a little tougher terrain in some form, and even maybe not so tough terrain. They're talking about some more rugged areas, but I think this would be valuable to folks that are dealing with maybe lower precip areas, 15 inches or under, or maybe 20 inches and under, where we're dealing with a little bit different type of a climate there. So go back and listen to this. I think there's some good information in there, and really like what they're doing with this research in terms of trying to find those gene markers in there that we could be looking at as producers when we're selecting replacements, when we're selecting bulls, and we continue to see efficiency being pushed in our industry. And again, moderation, I think, is one of the keys in all of this when it comes down to a lot of this at the end of the day. So some good research there. You can check it out. You can also go to the University of Idaho's Extension Center webpage as well, and you can find out more information there. We're going to take a break, and when we come back, the Captain Tim O'Byrne, editor of Working Ranch Magazine, will be in for this week's edition of Tim's 2 Cents, and we'll hear from meteorologist Don Day with a look at our long-term weather. This segment today brought to you by Tank Toad, your remote water monitoring, all from the convenience of your phone, powered by solar, satellite, and cell. Keep an eye on your water supply with a daily text message. You can call Meadowlark Solutions today for tank monitors, well controllers, generators, and more. 801-252-6135, or check them out online at tanktoad.com.
Fascinated by our wild weather? Now you can learn, appreciate, and understand the weather in your own backyard with the new Tropo Rain Gauge. Having achieved the highest rating of any product reviewed by the weatherstationexperts.com, the Tropo boasts rugged durability, impeccable accuracy, and precision to the 100th of an inch. Visit measurerain.com to order a Tropo today and use code RAINDAY. That's RAINDAY for free shipping and 10% off. Go to measurerain.com.
Hey, Justin. Hey, everybody out there in Working Ranch Radio Land. Man, it's still hot down here in the Southwest. All next week is still going to be up in the lower hundreds, 102, 103, and then I think it's going to cool off after that. I love catching up with all you good folks on our Facebook Friday post where you let us know what the weather is, what you're doing, what you wish you were doing, and what you're thankful for doing. That's another big thing. Now, get to my Tim's 2. All right. Well, now this is I'm looking at the Ranch Record. This is a fabulous magazine, folks. I want you to check it out and subscribe to it. The official publication of the Ranching Heritage Association there in Lubbock, Texas. And they got a beautiful grounds there down by Texas Tech. And they've put a bunch of buildings together and they recreated an old ranching scenario, and there's educational center and everything there. And this magazine's fantastic. And this issue has just an outstanding story. There's two of them, actually. One is Keeping It Together. National Golden Spur Award winner Stephen T.O. Kleberg reflects on a career with King Ranch by the magazine editor Bob Welch. He just did an amazing job of chronicling T.O.'s contribution to ranching and the Kleberg family and the King Ranch. The whole thing is just an amazing article. And then a companion article to that is Buzzy as a Bee by Ross Hecox. And Ross is a good friend of ours. He's been in the industry writing and photographing for decades now and just does an excellent job on everything. For nearly a century, Buzz Thorpe has stayed focused on working cattle, riding horses, building relationships, and helping people. And so what the deal is here is that Joe N. Buzz Thorpe is this year's Ranching Heritage Association Working Cowboy Award winner. So congratulations to Tio and to Buzz. And thank you so much, Bob Welch and Ross Hecox, for putting together these great articles. Go to Ranching Heritage Association online and get a subscription to this magazine, folks. You're going to love every single page of it. Back to you in the booth, Justin.
All right, thanks, Captain, for that, and love what the Ranching Heritage Foundation is doing there. Again, that publication is called The Ranch Record. As the Captain said, another publication that you would want to be subscribed to. Of course, I'm assuming you're already subscribed to Working Ranch Magazine. And for those of you that are purebred breeders, registered outfits, or you're selling bulls or you're selling females as well, and kind of in light of our subject here today, where we were talking with Dr. Jim Sprinkle regarding some of the looking at the genetics out there for those cattle that are more efficient in some of these conditions. And we know that efficiency is being talked a lot about in the purebred and the registered business. There's an article on page 106 of the latest issue of Working Ranch Magazine, the September-October issue, by Jamie Pullman, where she interviews Chip Kemp, who's the Director of Commercial and Industry Operations for the American Simmental Association. Some great advice there for those of you that are in that registered business, selling off your genetics and how you market that. So I encourage you to check out the latest issue of Working Ranch Magazine. Well, as we switch directions, meteorologist Don Day is back with us this week. And Don, jumping right into probably something, and it's definitely been in the news here quite a bit this last week and in this weekend, is the Hurricane Helene in Florida. Now, as we start to see that moving inland, what do you suspect? Because I know you'd made a comment that, boy, it could really have some pretty broad impacts inland.
Yeah, this system is going to bring in a tremendous amount of rain to the interior. We always talk about the coastal areas for good reason, with the high winds and the tornadoes and the heavy rain. But as this remains of Helene come into the southeast and parts of the central United States, it's going to be curving west-northwestward, and we'll get into parts of the southern and southeast Corn Belt. We could see some very heavy rains in Georgia, even into as far west as Arkansas, southern Illinois, southern Indiana, the southern Appalachians of the Carolinas, into Kentucky, Tennessee. There could be some severe flooding and a lot of wind as it comes on in. So the hurricane is going to have some lingering impacts even into the start of the week. Okay.
So let's switch sides of the country just a bit here. Let's move to the western half of the country, because it's just been like we're repeating July and for some of us. And what do you see as we look further out? I know you'd mentioned before we went on air that maybe a little bit longer of this, but do see some changes potentially down the road into October.
Yeah, we're kind of in what I'd best describe as a log jam. The jet stream is kind of stuck in place right now. And part of the reason is the hurricane that's causing low pressure to be centered over the east central parts of the United States. And that keeps high pressure locked in place across a lot of the northern plains, the central and southern plains, all the way to the west coast. And that's going to hold for a little bit longer. Now, eventually, the log jam, like any log jam, is going to break. And when it does, you see the pattern do a 180. And so as we get, let's say, past the first full week of October, after, let's say, the 8th, 9th, 10th of October, towards the middle of the month, certainly areas in the western side of the U.S., the northern plains, they're going to see a return to colder, unsettled weather and maybe some wet weather as well. Keep in mind that there are stretches in September and October that can be quite warm and quite dry, especially in the West. Climatologically speaking, that does tend to happen. But when the reverse comes in, it can be quite a shock to the system. And so while a lot of the weather's been very benign, and it will be for another week or so, I expect by the middle of the month of October, that's going to be changing.
Okay. So we've kind of hit the northern plains a little bit. What about the southwest and down into California and across the Arizona, New Mexico, and in that country?
Well, they're really not going to see much. Now, you tend to see in October, parts of the southern Rockies can get some active weather. That would be the Four Corners area. That would be New Mexico into West Texas as these Pacific fronts ramp up. But as you get into the desert states, Arizona, Nevada, into California, it's traditionally a very quiet time of year. And I think that'll be the case. Their weather, if it's going to get more busy, is probably going to be later in the month of October into early November.
Okay. All right. Well, Don, appreciate the update. We'll visit with you next week.
See you then.
You bet. And again, that is meteorologist Don Day with a look at our long-term weather. If you want to tune in each and every morning to his daily video podcast, you can find it at dayweather.com. Well, thanks again for tuning in and joining us here today on the Working Ranch Radio Show. This is a production of Working Ranch Magazine, branded #1 by America's Ranchers. If you don't have a subscription, you can get started with a subscription to Working Ranch Magazine by going to workingranchmag.com. Be sure to tune in next week, same time, same place, or on your favorite podcast provider. I'm Justin Mills, and until next time, keep your chin down and your mind in the middle. So long.